With me today are Steph Moss.
Hi, guys.
And Pastor Jim Leonard.
Good morning. It's afternoon. How are you? Good morning. Good morning. Hello.
Pastor Jim is our local historian. So if you have not listened to it, if you're new or maybe weren't here when we did it, Jim has recorded what did we do? Like a 10-part series on the history of Cornerstone Church of West Los Angeles. Yeah. It is a great listen. It's an incredible listen. And so in another time you can go back and listen to this. This is a bit of a bonus episode connected to that history. But we're going to look back at the history of the church from the lens of mission, from the lens of both our participation in the local mission here in Los Angeles and the mission of God across the globe. So why don't if we were going to start, Jim, I asked you to talk with us about and share about the history of mission of the church. Where would you start that conversation?
I would start it with an organization that was in Los Angeles back at the turn of the last century that was trying hard to start churches in places around town or outside of town. This being one of those that was outside of town. So most people don't know, weren't alive, hadn't thought about it, that Los Angeles was like 12 miles east of here. This was nothing but prairie, grass, but there was a well-traveled road out to the beach, and people would bring lumber and they'd build little beach houses along to stay the night and go back, home afterwards. But this was nothing. Then the federal government began to establish these medical centers all over the country. They were called old soldiers' homes, but they were for Civil War soldiers from both the North and South, who at that point were in their 70s, 80s, 90s, and needed a lot of health care that came out of the Civil War. And so they bought some property right here and built a hospital, which is still here.
Which is now the VA.
VA.
Yeah.
And immediately, of course, a town formed around it because they had employees, they staffed it all up. So the little town was built, and the area is called Sawtell, so the town became Sawtell. And the first mission that we're talking about, I think, is there's a Los Angeles Mission Society that started this church in Sawtell.
Wow.
So we were a mission in the beginning, and I think that's the key to what we do all the time, because that's what we were.
People show up, right? You show up to this big brick building, and you think of, I'm here as a part of established church, but we're part of a church plant.
Yeah.
Right? Like this was a church plant from the turn of the century.
Right.
And I know some of us know that experience more immediately, having planted Shoreline almost 20 years ago. But long before that, this church was a church plant, an extension of, I think, what's amazing to me is that there were, at that time, people here in Los Angeles with this same burden for the mission of God, for participating in the mission of God, and said, how can we do that? How can we spread the gospel to places where it is needed, to people who need to hear it? And that established this church because there was a new community. And so there needed to be people here reaching that community.
And I think we're still on mission.
Yeah.
I don't think that has stopped in the history of the church, nor should it ever, I suppose.
Yeah.
But there's some people who moved here and some people who actually already lived here. Some of them were employees. They got together, about 20 of them. There was a school that had been built where, if you know, on Santa Monica Boulevard where the post office is, that's the approximate location of the school. Nothing else is around. The railroad track came right down where Santa Monica Boulevard is now. And that was the center of town, such as it was. And so these people rented the school building on Sundays to have church in.
Really?
Yeah. And so that was our first church. And then, of course, everybody had open stoves. Nobody had like air conditioning those days. They had open stoves to heat. So houses caught fire all the time. The church or the school burned down. And so the church got some money together and built a building, and then they rented it to the school. to return the favor, basically, right?
Wow.
And so then we had a little building over about where the city library is now, and
On Santa Monica Boulevard?
On Santa Monica Boulevard.
Okay.
And that's where the church was first housed and began to grow. So that was the start of all this. And
Is that the picture that you had? I saw you had a picture of. Is that the?
no, that
the
is
building?
actually that's the.
Oh, I'm skipping ahead.
No, yeah.
You keep
So-
going.
So we've been through several buildings.
Yeah, since we're doing audio, let's describe the picture.
Yeah, hold it up so you can see it.
Yeah.
I mean, but that's only, I mean, that's like 5 blocks away.
Yeah, it's not far at all.
And when we talk
Wow.
about this location, I don't know. I don't know why. I guess I never really knew where that original location was, but I imagined it further. But
It's not.
it was a small
It's not,
town.
yeah,
Like it was just,
yeah.
it was all right here.
Yeah, it was all right here, and it was very,
Interesting.
very nearby. This we're right in the center of it, basically. So we've kind of always been that. When this church was built, it was at the edge of town. So the town grew up around us, but when we started over there, that we were right literally in the center of town, and that was our mission, or some people's mission. This group in Los Angeles that wanted a church here started, so we were the mission. And that's how we began. And they found a pastor, and they went through several pastors because it was really tough times and nobody had any money. And they kept funding us to keep us going, which is typical of what happens.
So the group, I mean, that's a fascinating dynamic too, that for years, this church was funded by those in Los Angeles.
Yes.
Over in Los Angeles.
Yes.
It's hard for us to picture.
Yeah.
Right?
Yes.
Over in Los Angeles, who had a passion and recognized that this church wasn't going to be sustainable. So they wanted to sacrifice for, in that sense, the multiplication, for the spread of that mission,
Yeah.
even just to the communities around them.
Yeah, exactly right. And that went on for a long time. And you remember the 30s were a time
Yeah.
for the Great Depression. So there was a lot of startup cost over decades that organization funded. And but there are all kinds of problems with money, close to bankruptcy a couple of times. It was always very, very difficult up through the 1930s, which is the Depression era, and everybody had trouble with money. So that all played into what the church could do. So it just was struggling the whole time. So it took a while for somebody to be able to go out of this church supported as a missionary.
Yeah. For a long time, this church family, you know, as I think about church plants, about those who have planted churches, even about the church plants that have gone out from here and that will go out from here, that's a helpful perspective to remember that it was for decades, this church was the external missional effort, right? There was, and them living on mission here took, in that sense, all of their resources and time and energy.
Oh yeah,
Before they were established enough to look beyond here.
And we had, we couldn't pay the pastor. There are times when we couldn't pay the pianist. There was no organ. There were a number of problems, number of issues, and this church struggled with money for a very long time because of that. And one of the issues of sending out missionaries was, if you can't even pay your own pastor, how do you support somebody who's going out from you onto the field? So which was I think fascinating because this church knew its heritage. They continued to reach out to people who came to work here or live here. And really for a long time, that was the best that they could do. So the first missionary who was sent out by this church wasn't until the 1930s. And it's interesting that happened because that was great, the Depression era.
Yeah.
But-
when you said the 30s, that surprised me, actually.
So our first one was Dorothy Wright. And she has an interesting history because she was... her mother died giving birth to her. Her father was involved in the church. She wanted to go, but in those days, women didn't go as missionaries, and so that was very much an uphill battle for her. She was born in, I think 1919 was when she was born. And she finally got sent out by the church post World War II in 1948 for several reasons. One, because
So she was hoping to get sent out in the 30s.
yes,
And trying,
wanting to, which everybody knew.
Okay, I'm sorry. I want you to continue the story, but I just want to point out the fact that I think that's also a really helpful reminder for a lot of our people, especially young people who are excited about going out or doing something that oftentimes it takes perseverance, and endurance, and waiting for the Lord's timing, which doesn't. I would imagine that it was Dorothy. You said, right?
Yes.
I imagine for Dorothy there were times in there where the Lord's timing did not make sense.
Yeah.
But
I'm sure.
But okay, so I'm sorry, but in the after World War II, and then then the World Wars happen, and well, I guess we're not going places now. So after World War II, she was sent out.
She was. She wanted to go to an obscure place where nobody had ever gone before. She wound up going to Oaxaca and working with Indian tribes there. And she she translated the Bible. She was very, very intensely involved in that. It was a very difficult place to be. She caught a lot of diseases, a lot of struggles there, a lot of bad hygiene issues. But she persevered and began translating the Bible into Oaxacan. I mean, she was full on as a missionary. And I think that was quite inspiring too. The women that I met, the older women in the church that I met and talked to, told me about her. Probably a dozen or more of them spoke about her being an inspiration to them. No one had seen that before, and they looked at her and thought, "We can do this. Women can do this, and they can go to tough places and work there if they need to." And it kind of changed the whole atmosphere about missions. And I wasn't here in those days, but that's what I heard when I came. The first thing I heard was, "You got to meet Dorothy Wright when she comes back, and talk to her because she's amazing."
Wow, and that was, that was a time where the face of missions was changing a lot after World War II, because all of a sudden there was this accessibility across the globe, and so many people had been in foreign countries for the war effort. And then they came back and were like, wait, I could do this. I could do something similar for the kingdom, right? We could go to different, and so all of a sudden there was almost like this opening of the global mission field in a unique way. In addition to Dorothy Wright, did we experience that here?
You just hit on a big issue. So when World War II began, not so much World War I, but World War II began, and all kinds of people went to all kinds of foreign places to fight and whatever, but particularly places like the Philippines, which were in danger. But you could go there as a soldier, and that's where the battle was. But you could also be in the culture because it was not yet taken over by the enemy. And so people came back saying, those people don't know a thing about Jesus. These soldiers would come back saying, there's no churches, there's nothing there. And they would want to go back. And so this started this whole kind of broadcasting of the truth about Jesus into everywhere. People wanted to go everywhere, and that's where many of our missionaries got their inspiration and took off and went someplace. And we had a lot of people, a lot of couples who went out and went to exactly those places, the Philippines, and to other places. And some, it took a while, but we even went into Japan. But that was kind of the first missionary effort was in that direction, and boosted by the fact that we had already been out there. We knew what was there now, and we wanted to go back and change it. So that was huge.
Wow.
At that point, do you know if it was the church able to be the sending source, or was it still through the Los Angeles?
Yeah,
missions?
good question. No, by then the economy changed. You remember the 30s was the Great Depression,
Right.
so everybody was out of money. So even though the church was beginning to thrive, nobody had any money, so they continued to borrow money from this agency in Los Angeles. But after the war, the economy boomed. And when it boomed, the church began to be self-supporting and had extra money and could afford to send people to other countries. So that was exactly what happened. From then on, we were off and running for this issue.
Wow.
Interesting.
So, yeah.
Interesting. So what took place? I mean, then, like, I don't know if you have names or specifically, what did that?
Yeah. I have names.
What happened then? Okay, yeah.
Okay, so a lot of couples went out. So there's the Tuggies, Leonard and Jeanette Tuggy went to the Philippines. There was a woman who really wanted to go to the Congo. Mary Fletcher was her name, and you'll recognize the name Fletcher because we name our upstairs little meeting area, Fletcher Lounge, after her. And she had been raised by some of the pastors in the church. It was an interesting background. She bounced around from family to family for a bit, but she really, really wanted to go. And so she was able to get support from the church and went off to the Congo, was not there very long at all. She was in a car accident and died. And so that was one of the sadder and more shocking moments in that whole history. But it didn't seem to dampen people. I mean, everybody knew that it could be dangerous out there, but quite the opposite. It seemed to encourage people to want to go and almost, not take her place, but do what she did.
As a single woman, she went to the Congo.
Yes,
in the what?
In the 1940s.
40s?
Yeah.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah.
Wow.
The war changed everything about women working. I mean, many women in this church told me how they built airplanes. Can't think of the name of it. It's a bomber, but in Santa Monica, what's now Santa Monica Airport. They were the women who put the big tires on and hammered the thing together and did all this stuff that nobody allowed women to do before World War II, but all the men were in service
field.
somewhere. Yeah. So the women went to work, and so it changed our sense of how we lived life altogether, the warriors. So many of the women after that continued to work, and the church was inundated with offerings, had plenty of money. That's when the building was redone and bricked and upgraded and broadened. The spot we're in right now used to be the Sunday school room, and this was the only building of the church. So and now we have a whole other building. Anyway, but families went. So I mentioned the Tuggies. We also had people from other countries who had come here. Who wanted to go, and so some of the people we sent were not really people from this country, but people from other countries, and they were wonderful people. They're great. They'd been in the war too. So one of them, Tony Pizzotto, was one of them that I knew. Was a great guy, and he had been in the Philippines fighting the war, and he returned to the Philippines to work there as a missionary. We had a person who was a Jewish man Baruch Goldstein, who was also a missionary. Wes and Susie Brenneman, and Scott and Donna Grandi. These are all people who in the church were famous for going out and doing mission work and were well known. Their names are pretty much lost today, but I knew all of them and met them when I came here. And the church was very excited about what they were doing. And many of them are still doing that work.
So I feel like what you're describing is the kind of sending wave in the 60s into the 70s.
Yes.
So basically after the war, this kind of mission sending passion seems to have just continued. Did it continue just, I would imagine, kind of in different waves throughout those decades, throughout the 40s and 50s and 60s and into the 70s? Or was there just kind of a constant, a constant movement of people being both investing in the community here and being sent out from here?
Yeah, this is before my time, but as I talked to the people who were here, the sense was that there was this big enthusiasm for doing this. And when people came to church here and they heard about it and they got intrigued by it, they would begin to think about it themselves. And so we were part of a larger network of churches called the Conservative Baptist Association in those days. Conservative in theology, not in politics. But that became also a sending agency because we weren't the only church who was doing that. Post World War II, pretty much all churches were doing that, and the organizations began to raise money to do this as well. The Conservative Baptist Association helped with this. So it became, so sometimes we would get to the place where we were sponsoring missionaries who were also being sponsored by other churches rather than we doing the whole thing. And so that was a whole new breed of people where we were one of their supporters, and it was a little less personal, but it would reach an area, and the church was looking for ways to reach areas where they already didn't have somebody, or where something special was going on, like you were starting a school or something.
So as the church developed into that time when you were here, right, and you knew some of even some of these names that you've mentioned, like the Brennemans and the Grandes, are names I recognize, at least, and people I think we've met obviously at the end of their missionary careers. But how did that impact and shape the church in your, or even your own sense of mission in your early years here?
Yeah, it was talked about from the pulpit. It was in the newsletter when it came out. There were frequent visiting missionaries coming back to talk about it, and sometimes they would come here for special reasons, like they'd stay here in one of the church's buildings and get a PhD so they could go back someplace and teach in Japan or someplace. So it was it was much larger dynamic, I think, and the church was much more hands-on for that. And the back and forth, people going out with groups to go to the Philippines and build a building or help. There would be a medical team go out, and we still do this to this day. But it was much more prevalent, and there was almost always something going on, and people were very excited about it. Very excited about missions.
How did that? I'm sorry, Steph.
I'm enjoying being an active listener. This is just fascinating. I'm in class right now.
So how did that emphasis? How did that mission emphasis and the presence of that? How did that impact the church's sense of its own purpose here in Los Angeles?
That's a good question. I think that by the time I got here, there had a wave of strong interest in getting onto college campuses had developed. And so several of the missionaries with quotation marks that I knew or met were working not overseas but here, and particularly the main campuses, UCLA and USC, Cal State LA a little bit, even Loyola. It's kind of funny to work at Catholic when you're a Protestant, but they did. So okay, and it was exciting, and then that also began to generate people who not only came to faith, but then wanted to either go back home to where they'd come from, or go out someplace new, and so we then began to have a kind of a college level of sending missionaries. And I was I think, a little confused about that. I didn't quite figure out how this was all working because I was new to this as well, even though I'd been in church, grew up in church and all. But I was new as a believer, and so for me, that was puzzling and exciting. I somehow thought a missionary had to be, cross an ocean somehow to do this. But there was this turn where mission began to mean places where there are not a lot of believers and where there needs to be a concentrated effort to reach people and where there's resistance. On college campuses, there was often a lot of resistance.
Did church members see that and internalize that as a part of their calling as well? I mean, if there weren't a lot of Christians in their workplaces or at the school they were attending, was that a part of the movement, or was missions in that sense primarily what other people did?
To my eye or ears, there was a much stronger intentional awareness of my position in a company, in a group in a profession, things like that. The churches I grew up in, I have to tell you, I was not a believer. I just went to church because that's what we always did. And I didn't pay a lot of attention. But here, as a believer, I was struck by the intensity of people's desire to honor God, to serve Him by talking to people where they worked, and people got in trouble for this, or where they're going to school, and they'd sit up in classes and make a speech or an argument, a discussion or something like that about it, and then there would be trouble. All that was going on, and it was not considered part of the missions. Missions was those people that we helped financially, sent somewhere deliberately. And these are people who were just going out on their own and doing stuff and coming back and talking about it and asking, for prayer and things. And it took a while, but because of the acuity of some of our pastors talking about it from the pulpit, people began to catch on that we were we were doing missions out of our building, right out of our congregation right here, and that caused some questioning, some difficulty with some of the older people who had a kind of a classical sense of missions. And so there began to be, in my mind at least, two groups in the church who were looking at missions in different ways. And that caused some difficulty. There were people who wanted funding for things that other people didn't think should be funded. And so that was one of the many battles that churches go through. It was, no big deal, but I remember that distinctly. Like, I thought this would be all, kind of peaceful, but no, it was a aggravated discussion, I guess I'd say.
Okay.
I think what strikes me the most hearing you talk is exactly what you just pointed out. I think in my head, I'm one that thought missions was always the old school version of it was this stereotype of you just send this one person to this very remote country, and that was the only picture. But to hear you color this beautiful illustration of this place being, I just really appreciated like the broad illustration. You talked about not just being unreached peoples, but even I hadn't heard it, places of resistance, right? And you even think resistance being, well, it's a closed country. Well, no, college campuses, resistance, public school systems now, resistance to hearing about the good news. And so that's, wow. I really appreciate just that broad illustration and knowing that I'm in a place that saw mission so holistically. It's really beautiful.
And some places, on college campuses, there was pushback. Professors didn't want you talking about bringing religion into your paper or whatever. And some industries absolutely didn't care. It was like a lot of people here worked for in the movie industry or in television, and they tended to be fine come on, talk to us about this. And that surprised me, but that's what I got. That's the feedback I got. Others, it was a mixed bag. I remember one person who was a doctor who worked independently, but then got into whatever that cohort of doctors thing is, that when you open a
practice.
Yeah, practice. Thank you. That's the word. It's a complicated word. And he started talking about his faith and was asked to leave the practice, And so there were all kinds of responses, but I don't know. I thought it was exciting that this little brick building was going out in all these different directions, doing all these different things. And who would have expected that people would actually listen and hear and begin to show up? Maybe not here, maybe they were Catholic or I don't know what, but began to think about faith. I thought it was a very exciting atmosphere. I was stunned by it.
So go ahead.
Oh no, I'm processing internally. You go ahead. All right, so as that continued through the 70s, the 80s and 90s, how did that, how did the church's participation in mission continue to develop or change?
That's a good question. There were several factors. We were involved in the Vietnam War at one point, and when we pulled out of Vietnam, a lot of Vietnamese in the South who had been loyal to the U.S. were in danger, and so the U.S. loaded them up on ships and brought them back here. And we, along with every other church in the country, as far as I could tell, were asked to help take some of the families and house them. And at that point, where our parking lot is now, church had bought a bunch of rundown little apartments to tear down and build parking. And so instead of tearing them down, we fixed them up, and we had families from Vietnam, Vietnamese people living there. And that was a mixed bag because some of them did not have any, they knew nothing about Christianity, didn't want to. Others were just, wondrously amazed that we would do that, and they started coming to church and grew in faith. And so that became a mission outreach for the lay people of the church. If they're right literally across this little strip there, it's called an alley in those days. And we were helping them. We were giving clothes and helping the parents get jobs and things. And then that began to feed. Again, that's a line of feedback. They would bring over relatives and talk to them about faith, and so that happened. Another thing that happened was we had other churches starting that had no place to meet because on the west side was getting more and more expensive. And so we began to look for other languages that could meet in our facilities and start churches here. And so that became another way of missions, if you will, reaching out to people who are building a church, primarily from new believers. And so that was a whole new bucket of worms or something, but it was really fascinating to see that and to walk down through the other building and hear languages hear preaching in other languages going on, and so that began to be a factor.
That's fascinating.
Yeah, I think it is.
And there were into the 90s. Am I jumping ahead of you here?
No, you're fine. I'm tired. I have notes, but I can't read my own handwriting. So go ahead.
But because I know now missionaries and people that have been both reached and became believers here through the mission of the local church here, and those that were sent out from here in the 90s into the 2000s. It seemed like that continued, And, as the church ebbed and flowed and went through different seasons, but this sense of mission, both for this place and this world, was continually working. I mean, I'm thinking of the Youngs in Turkey, the Arnolds, I guess Gustafsons were probably sent out maybe a little before that, maybe the 80s, 90s,
late 80s.
I don't know.
Late 80s.
I don't know the dates, but
Seems like a
but there
long
was,
time ago.
yeah. I mean, but it seemed like that, both that ongoing local presence and the global presence continued through all these, through the turn of the next century, in a sense.
Yes. Yes. And there was nobody calls this a mission project, but I thought it was. We began a school here. I don't know if
Oh, that's right.
Yeah.
That's right.
And the school was intended to be a mission outreach.
And it existed for about 20 years, right?
Yes. Uh-huh.
Okay.
And was we had services every week for them, and a lot of kids were already in Christian families, but a lot weren't, and so that became an outreach, and we helped other churches in other languages. So at one point we had like 3 different languages here: Korean, Arabic, and something else. That weren't our churches. They were independent churches, but they used our building and our like children's area for their kids and stuff. And that became, I mean, we weren't doing it. We were just providing the space, but that became an outreach. The number of people at one point who were Jewish, who were Christians, I was totally surprised and delighted by. And because they had a biblical background that some others didn't have. If you were Chinese in here, you had nothing. It'd start from scratch. But if you were Jewish, you had some background in that, and so that was a whole other amazing thing to me, that Jews would become Christians.
How did all this come to be? So, like, do you feel like it was just God, his provision and just kind of bringing the right people, the right churches, the right kind of missions focus at the right timing, and people just responded faithfully? Or was it a organized effort? We're going to go find like-minded churches of this, of different languages, looking for a space. Like, how can you might not even know how it came, but I'm curious if if it was a intentional effort of, we're going to go seek out this particular mission. Sometimes churches get, this is going to be our thing and we're going to go do this. Or do you feel like it was just God kind of leading and you guys responding faithfully to whatever he was bringing before you?
Oh, I wish it was that. It was fallen, stupid people trying to do, unfallen, brilliant things. And
that should be can we have that be the subtitle?
Jim, I think you just titled your next book.
I like it.
It's just crazy. And there were always, I suppose as long as there are sinful people, there will be battles. The church is a great place for battles. Oh my gosh. And so there were always objections and people who said, this is too costly. We shouldn't be doing this. We should be putting our money into building, an elevator somewhere. I don't know. But something. But and people would complain when we'd have another church move in to start up, like I was just speaking about. People would say, "Well, we want to keep that space for ourselves. That was where we got coffee or something." And so there were always there was always a pushback, and different pastors handled it different ways. And for a while, so we had. Let's see if I can back up a bit. Pastorally, at the end of World War II. A pastor came in, and with him, a whole bunch of people came back from the war effort, and they had been trained by the war years to set aside their differences and work together, push hard to do something, because that's what you do in war, right? And so, and he was a strong leader, a brilliant man, Dr. Thomas. His father had founded Denver Seminary. He was very, very, very smart guy. And under his leadership and with this enthusiasm, if you will, the church, just blossomed with projects and missionaries and all kinds of things, and money coming in to fund all this, and building the gymnasium building, and buying property up so we could make a bigger church, and inviting other churches. All that was going on in the 50s and 60s, and then he retired. And he was the mainstay. It was like he had been here forever, as far as everybody knew. And so what you had then was the church had to adjust to a new person, and that was very hard for the church. And so then there began to be pushback on things. And this is not how we've done it. These I don't know these people. Those kinds of issues that are just human struggles, but they really impacted how we did local missions, and it also impacted how we enlightened people to the need for missions around the world. And are you thinking you might want to go, or are you feeling called by God? And so then things began to change, and some of our missionaries retired, and we didn't replace them, and so it became a rockier, more difficult time. And so what we had then, instead of having one pastor for like 15 years, we had pastors for like 6-year segments, which is about as long as they could take it, and then they'd move on. And that was very difficult. It was difficult for me as a new believer, but it was difficult for the church. And so we went through a time there where it was like God was shaking up the whole thing. And part of that, I think, had to do with we were not in that post-war era anymore. We had moved on. God knew that. A few people knew that, but most of the church didn't seem to. And I don't want to put blame on there. I just think it became a habit that this is how we did things, and that's how we did missions.
It's amazing to me that how the Lord both preserves and works his mission through all these different fallen seasons.
Yes.
And I think that, even in our own season, I'm sure there's ways in which we are far from the perfect church, right? Yeah. There's all sorts of things we could be doing better, ways we can grow, but God uses every group. At the same time, the Lord's blessed us with some incredible spiritual health.
Yeah.
Some incredible people in this season. And I think when it comes to the mission of God, what strikes me is that the health that he's given us is a stewardship, that he's given to us for a purpose so that we might participate in his mission in this way. The relative to the history, the financial stability we have is a stewardship that we might use for his mission. And this legacy is a stewardship that we might steward for his mission. So I want to, maybe with just the last bit of our time, I want to jump to, now that we're like the 80s, 90s, 2000s, Jim, you're now talking about missionaries and partners and things like that Steph, you're familiar with.
Starting to hear some familiar names.
and as you think about both our legacy partners, who are a number of these long-term partners who we've had for years and are, retiring one by one, each of the coming years. But then we think of our key partners, and what's fascinating to me about our key partners is that we have this combination of some long-term missionaries and ones that we inherited from these seasons, like the Gustafsons or the Humbles, that came out of kind of these seasons and movements at the church and are some of our closest partners, our most invested partners today. And then we also have some newer partners and organizations that actually were sent and founded in the last 20 years, like newer works, whether it's AFRU or Enlace, and a 50-year-old partner, or a partner that's existed for 50 years here in Los Angeles, like Claris, and one that's new in the last 10, like Prodigal Sons. And so we see just this constant overlap and continual growth and continual development of not only partners globally and locally, but also our own sense of our purpose here in the city, here and now. I mean, Steph, when I'm curious how hearing the history of all of this and the way in which these partnerships and the mission of God has taken shape here, how that falls on your ears as you have been so singularly focused on our partnerships and our mission here over the last few years, kind of as a modern representative of that, how that strikes you.
Yeah. The thing that keeps kind of resonating even ever since I met Pastor Jim, but then particularly just right now in your storytelling, I'm so struck by I want to say the roots maybe, that I had no idea kind of where we started, and how faithful you have been through it all. And it's, and just that, and that how faithful God has been through it all, that there is still our God is missional. And like, that didn't change because this church's, we were into that in the 30s and 40s. And then we kind of came back around in the 2000s. Some churches were into that, the one church on the east side, or it's that, no, God is a missional God, and he uses us. I just hearing you talk about through seasons of resistance and political, things going on, wars, and cities being built from the prairies to now being, West LA and very overly populated. I just can't believe that the work that I get to be a part of today, seeing this, it has remained. It has continued, and it looks different in different iterations, but it's just, there's some roots there. There's a faithfulness there, and that in rocky times, in good times. And you said sometimes that I think the word you used was, it was really exciting or energizing, or there was a word you used.
Yeah.
And that I've also heard you say in this story that there was times that it was a little rough or contentious, and saying, but the call was still there, or the mission was still there, or the need was still there. Yeah. And so knowing that, it's like this legacy that is, or we use the word inheritance in the cohort, that you're really actually bringing that to life for me, that it is God's work, and that it continues no matter what the landscape looks like, literal landscape, or the political landscape, or the people landscape, or the pastors who are in power. It's just, or not in power, that's the pastors who are pastoring a church. It's just, and that I get to know you, who knows this history, but who has lived it and stayed steady and faithful. And I think something I can keep being curious about with you is like, there's people who get excited about missions and then they go, or they're excited for a season, they kind of burn out, or that was that year, that thing they did in their 20s when they had time and energy. And it just, ever since knowing you, you've just been so committed. It's like you just knew this is part of who God is, and who the local church is. And like, what a gift that you pass it on to us, but that you've it's not just you passing it on, you're just helping us see that there's so many people that have been a part of this, and so many, and that ultimately that it was God carrying, that it's God a part of this. It's just, what a gift. So I love my job. Well, and more so, even if I didn't work here, gosh, you're growing my love for this church, right? And my deeper understanding of God's heart for the world, and his people.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you.
That's encouraging.
I mean, it's so amazing to think back into, and it is so humbling to see ourselves as a small piece of this. One of the things that struck me as you were talking about this, from the establishment of the church to all the things that the Lord's done through it, whatever it was, 19 years ago now, we planted a church here in West Los Angeles. And I think in some senses, both in the time and even at different times of conversations, it's wow, what a strange thing to do, or what an incredible thing to do, or how did you? And your story makes even just that season in my life feel really normal.
Yeah,
like it wasn't this extraordinary thing. It was just normal. It was just what the church does. And we were at that point in life taking the step that the Lord had laid before us, doing what the church does. And now in this season, and each of our church plants that have been sent out, each of the people that get sent out get trained up from here and sent out in all sorts of different ways to different parts of the country and different parts of the world. Like, this is just what the church does.
Yeah, it is. I grew up on a farm, and on a farm you have issues with like weeds. It sounds funny, but there are certain weeds that if your cattle eat them, they'll die or get very sick. And so every once in a while we would do this crazy thing where we'd wait for like a westerly wind, and we'd get on the east side of the pasture, and we'd go along and we'd light fires in the grass all along there. So the wind would carry the fire through the pasture and burn up all the grass and all the weeds. And then you wait about 2 weeks, and all this beautiful green grass grows up out of the ground. Thank you, God. And our cattle can't eat that, right? And I had a sense that, it's really stupid analogy, but I was really sense that God moves us through. He comes through, and he looks like he's killing everything off somehow. All the people, that like Dr. Thomas is no longer here, and many of our missionaries have retired and died, and yet this background, this story continues, and here we are. We're the fresh green grass that's growing up and doing this all over again, right? And then that time will come where we will hand it over to someone else to do the same by God's grace. I love that. So,
Yeah,
that's so beautiful.
and it's like technically nothing new.
Yeah.
No, it's old. It's old.
Yeah.
I mean, you can read it in the Bible.
Yeah,
It's really old.
yeah, there's like nothing new under the sun. Wow.
Well, maybe as we wrap up, Jim, and I mean, you may have just shared a bit of this, but I would love for you to engaging your imagination. I'd love just to ask you what your dreams and hopes are for the next generation. If they're, I mean, whether it's us, whether it's people younger than you, whether it's us, even if it's the young adults and kids in our midst, as you think about the mission of God here and across the world, how do you hope this church will continue to participate on into the future?
I'm very excited about where we are right now. I think one of the great struggles that churches can have is that they get off kilter in their teaching and their understanding what God is doing in the doctrine and understanding God's movement. God, I think, is very patient and very gentle, but also pushes hard certain times in really rocky territory. And been through some of that, and that is really hard to see your way through. But when you look at it long term, there's tough places, and then there's things happen out of that are really great. May look bad, but suddenly it takes a turn, and it's God's hand is always on us and on the steering wheel, and always shaping where we're going. This we talked about. I think is a model for us. It may not look the same when we do it, but we are God's carriers, right? We're the ones who carry the words, the teaching, but we also carry the actions and the decisions that we make that other people see. Why are you doing that? Why are you giving away all this money? Or why are you putting yourself at risk, pushing back on your job and how you're not going to lie to your clients, or I don't know what the deal is, but in all kinds of ways, we're all making or moving through this culture that we're in, and it may look like we're burning up, but what we're really doing is we're creating ground for someone to grow in their faith and spiritual truth, and I think this church is the kind of the center of that, and the encouragement place of that, the place where we say, okay, we'll support you. You go do this if that's what you think God's calling you to do. Or where we just say, you're having trouble at work, we'll pray for you and let us know how it goes. All that is God's work, and without us seeing that, God doesn't like go out and do some huge thing. He works very quietly and patiently through people like us and the people who are listening to this. And these people that I have, some of whom I met and some of whom I know only by someone else talking about them, who have gotten us to this point. We are their legacy. And we are going to be the ones who create a legacy for those who come. Do we know that? Do we recognize that? Do we see the wonder of that and the joy of that?
Well, Jim, you've helped us see that today in some really significant ways. I mean, I know it's been really significant moving for me, for you, Steph, and for our entire cohort listening. And so, on behalf of all of us, I just want to thank you both for your faithfulness and for just the work to recall and to research and to be able to share with us this story. It is a incredibly unique blessing.
Thank you. I thank God that I have had the chance to do it. That's amazing.
Yeah. And thanks, Steph, for being here. Thanks for the ways in which you get to participate in this moment of this church's history. It is really exciting to get to do that. And for all of you listening, thanks for being a part of this with us. It is an incredible blessing to get to be a part of this moment where God is doing significant things that He will, that others will recall for a long time, not to our glory, and they'll hopefully just forgetting our names, but to the glory of God along the way.
Yep.
So thanks for listening. Thanks for being a part of it.